The ending for the Elden Ring DLC cements Radahn as one of the most tragic heroes that have ever been created by George R.R. Martin and Hidetaka Miyazaki. The ending recontextualizes so much of the existing lore, and we see things in a whole new light. The biggest revelation from the ending is that we learn there was a vow made between Miquella and Radahn for the latter to become Miquella's consort. However, the game never says if Radahn willingly agreed to make that vow. I think it's very telling that we never get to hear Radahn speak. We only have secondhand sources. Now, according to Freya,
as the Festival of War concluded, General Radahn's soul met an honorable end. But kindly Miquella wishes to revive it, which is fine by me. I know it would pain old Jeren, but war has always suited General Radahn best, and certainly far more than any honorable death. Endless war to invigorate the soul, as befits General Radahn.
but to be honest, I don't think she knows what's best for Radahn. I really doubt that Radahn would want to be revived without his beloved horse. Remember, Radahn learned gravity magic because he did not want to abandon his scrawny steed. Radahn wants to ride Leonard, not Miquella. I also think Freya is now more loyal to Miquella than Radahn, as she tells us, the guidance of kind Miquella remains etched into my very flesh.
I was stricken by scarlet rot in the swamp of Aeonia, and yet he drained the poison from it.
In addition to feeling indebted to the person who saved your life, I could also see traces of Miquella's charm still lingering inside her. But even if Freya is right that Radahn would want endless war, that directly contradicts what we learned from Miquella.
I'll make the world a gentler place.
We also learn from his circlet that he wants to have an age of compassion. But if Miquella's world requires endless war, that is not an age of compassion. I don't see how waging endless war makes the world a gentler place. Frankly, I think there's evidence for something much more sinister. It's heavily implied that Miquella charmed Radahn into vowing to become a consort against his own wishes. Now, a major clue comes from this statue found in Loretta's arena at the Erdtree. This statue shows Miquella and Malenia embracing a third figure. Now, the identity of this third person has been a major mystery, but after the DLC, I think this statue shows a young Radahn. As we learn from their remembrance, Miquella admired Radahn for his kindness, and this statue does show that. This figure is wearing a circlet that looks a lot like Miquella's circlet of life, and that is the same circlet that appears when Miquella charms you during his grab attack. In other words, this third person may have been under Miquella's influence at the time. I'll also point out that the only confirmed portrait we have of Radahn is the portrait at Volcano Manor, but that portrait was clearly done when he was older, since you can see the bags and wrinkles under his eyes. And as we see from the young lion's helm, in his youth, Radahn braided his hair to look more like Radahn. Now, before the DLC, I did think that this third figure was Godwyn, and I will talk about Godwyn a bit later. But one gap in that theory was the fact that Malenia was also embracing that third man, and there really wasn't any connection between Godwyn and Malenia. But the DLC also gives us another lore bombshell. In the young lion set, we learn what Malenia murmured into Radahn's ear at the Battle of Aeonia. Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort. So Malenia also knew of the vow made between Radahn and Miquella, and this just adds a whole nother layer of tragedy to the battle. Having your mind violated and being overpowered by your younger stepbrother would be an incredibly traumatic experience. I could also imagine for Radahn, this type of violation would have felt especially humiliating. Radahn is supposed to be a massive Giga Chad warrior, and yet he wasn't able to stop a twink from overpowering him. Through this lens, we can see all of Radahn's actions in a whole new light. His desire for glory in battle could also be seen as self-destructive behavior as a response to trauma, but wrapped up in the glory of a militaristic culture. I'll also note that Radahn decided to settle in Redmane Castle, which is about as far away as one can get from the Erdtree by foot. So I could see Radahn choosing Caelid as a way of creating as much physical distance as possible to stay away from Miquella. I also believe that this vow was done when Radahn was young, and before the Starscourge conflict, since the Remembrance lets you get Radahn's greatswords that were immediately in his possession before his triumph over the Stars. Aside from Radahn, there is only one other person Miquella calls
Lord Brother.
Godwyn. As we learn from the Golden Epitaph, this was a sword made to commemorate the death of Godwyn the Golden, first of the demigods to die, infused with the humble prayer of a young boy. "O brother, Lord brother, please die a true death." And the young boy is Miquella, since when you use the Ash of War, a Erdtree sigil appears. As I argued in a previous video, Miquella tried to revive Godwyn through the eclipse, but the eclipse failed, and I believe that was because Radahn was holding back the stars. We can add another motive for why Radahn decided to conquer the stars. He was trying to preserve his freedom from Miquella. This would also explain why Radahn was so determined to keep holding back the stars even when he was fighting against Malenia, and more so, even when he was
eaten from the inside by Malenia's scarlet rot. His wits are long gone.
Even when he completely lost his mind, there was something instinctual about him wanting to keep the stars at bay. To me, that really signifies that there was some primal instinct of self-preservation, much more than concern about others or a desire for glory. I also don't think that Radahn realized his actions would affect Ranni. I know there's been a common theory that Radahn was working against Ranni because he was a fan of the Golden Order, but Iji and Jaren still seem to be on very good terms with one another. What's more, Iji is genuinely shocked that Radahn's actions had a negative impact on his own sister.
Oh no. Wait, how did I not see it before? I ought to retire as War Counselor for such a gross oversight. Let me explain. The fate of the Carian royal family is guided by the stars, as is the fate of Lady Ranni, first heir in the Carian royal line. But General Radahn is the conqueror of the stars, who stood up to the swirling constellations, halting their movement in a smashing victory. And so, if General Radahn were defeated, the stars would once again resume their movement, as would Lady Ranni's destiny.
Instead of them being enemies, I think Radahn and Ranni were actually working together to stop Miquella. Ranni is justifying her actions to escape the control of her two fingers, but Miquella was also chosen by his own two fingers. So by fighting against Miquella, Radahn would also be working against the two fingers. We already know that Ranni and Rykard were conspirators for the Night of the Black Knives, and we know that Rykard and Radahn are on good terms, since there's a portrait of Radahn at the Volcano Manor, and there are Iron Virgins at Redmane Castle and throughout Caelid. So I don't think it's a stretch to assume that Radahn and Ranni would be on good terms as well. Their actions could be read with this lens of stopping Miquella. On the Night of the Black Knives, the assassins specifically targeted Godwyn's soul, and as we learn from the Secret Rite Scroll, without a soul, Godwyn could not be used in the rite necessary to usher in a god's return, and by conquering the stars, Radahn prevented the eclipse, which would have revived Godwyn. Even if Godwyn replaced Radahn as Miquella's consort, Miquella would become a god and a massive threat to the lands between. Only in a FromSoft game could the most terrifying villain be a child who wants to make the world a gentler place. I think Ansbach is absolutely correct.
Miquella the Kind is a monster, pure and radiant. He wields love to shrive clean the hearts of men. There is nothing more terrifying. Miquella the Kind makes my blood run cold. I am loath to admit it, but even at this very instant I wish to run very far away indeed.
What makes Miquella so terrifying is that he doesn't understand what he's doing. Even though he's an absolute genius, he still has the mental understanding of a child, and his intentions are definitely well-meaning. He rightfully feels horrified when he learns the truth about his lineage and the bloodshed that was necessary to create America's Golden Order. For the Erdtree, I think Miquella wanted to create a new Erdtree, but without the original sin America committed. And yet, even though it was watered with his own blood since it was a sapling, the Erdtree ultimately failed to grow into an Erdtree. And when the Erdtree failed, I think Miquella sought a new method to become a god, much like how he turned to unalloyed gold when Golden Order fundamentalism failed to cure Malenia's scarlet rot. That brings us to Mohg. Ansbach confers that Mohg was enchanted by Miquella. In a previous video, I did make the case for why Mohg may have been bewitched by Miquella. After all, the very first item you can get that's related to Miquella is the Bewitching Branch, which tells us that Miquella has learned well how to compel affection, and the Erdtree could be seen as a massive bewitching branch. There was also this cut line of dialogue from Moog.
Miquella, why do you abandon me?
But I thought this bewitching was unintended or accidental. But in the DLC, we learned that Miquella used Moog to gain access to the Land of Shadow, and he's using Moog's body as a vessel to house Radahn's soul. That does raise the question, why was Moog needed to access the Land of Shadow? My best guess is that it relates to the Formless Mother. Both Moog and the Lands Between, as well as the Blood Fiends in the Land of Shadow, are able to commune with the Formless Mother. And Moog is also linked with Phantom Invaders who can pass between worlds. So I think Miquella used Moog's connection with the Formless Mother as a conduit to enter the Land of Shadow. The finale for the DLC also vindicates the endings for both Ranni and Goldmask. The game draws clear parallels between Miquella and Ranni.
I promise you, 1,000-year voyage guided by compassion.
Now cometh the age of the stars. 1,000-year voyage under the wisdom of the moon.
And we also have Ranni's penultimate line.
Let us go together.
That is also the name of the gesture that Miquella forces you into. So while Miquella forces people to be his consort, we choose to simp after Ranni. As we learn in the memory cutscene, Miquella sounds excited that he was chosen by the Two Fingers.
I'm going to be a god.
To put it mildly, that is the complete contrast to Ranni.
But I would not acquiesce to the Two Fingers. I stole the rune of death, slew mine own Empyrean flesh, casting it away.
I also think that when Ranni says,
I would not be controlled by that thing.
I think she was referring to Metyr specifically, and you can only access the Metyr boss fight if you do the questline for Count Emir, who was once a Caudian sorcerer. Brief side note about the Ranni ending. I want to focus on this line from the cutscene.
Here beginneth the chill night that encompasses all, reaching the great beyond.
Now the phrase Great Beyond does reappear in the English version of the DLC in the Staff of the Great Beyond. This was a staff fashioned from the tail fingers of Metyr, the Mother of Fingers. The Mother received signs from the greater will, from the beyond of the microcosm. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come. So when Ranni mentions the Great Beyond in her ending, this could also mean that space is free of the control of the Two Fingers and the greater will. In addition to vindicating Ranni, the DLC further cements the Goldmask ending as the best ending. As Goldmask correctly identified, the current imperfection of the Golden Order, or instability of ideology, can be blamed upon the fickleness of the gods no better than men. That is the fly in the ointment. Goldmask wants to limit the gods for being fickle, not ordinary humans. Miquella, on the other finger, is a completely different story. He literally has the power to control minds and take away free will, and that even includes the player. The entire DLC is motivated by Miquella's actions in chasing after Radahn, and this fickleness of the gods predates Marika and stretches all the way back to the Gate of Divinity, with the Hornsent becoming gods and oppressing people. There's also a very telling line from the Dryleaf Seal, which is the catalyst for those devoted to Miquella. Those who saw the decline of the Erdtree and the fallen leaves long ago braced themselves for the weakening of order and embraced a strict faith, and then they made to serve a new god. But of the 4 Elden Lord endings, the Goldmask ending is the only one where we don't see fallen leaves. So his mending rune is able to prevent the Erdtree from dying, even in a world where the Greater Will has abandoned the realm. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to know what yins think. With the DLC, there are so many lore videos I can't wait to make.